Biblical anarchy? Anarchy? Don't you know that anarchy means chaos? I mean, what? Have you ever heard of Romans 13? I mean, just God is not a God of lawlessness. And obviously, I mean, the best way to order society, because humans are sinners and they're fallen and they're depraved and they scheme and they're evil. And the only way to have society operate to correct for how sinful people are is to put those sinful people in charge of us. Is that right?
If Christ is king, how should the Christian consider the kingdoms of this world? What does the Bible teach us about human authority and what it means to love our neighbors and our enemies? Before we render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, let's know what it means to render unto God what is God's. This is the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, the modern prophetic voice against war and empire.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. I'm your host, Jacob Winograd. So for today's episode, I'm going to actually be replaying a episode from the Libertarian Christians Podcast where I made an appearance several months ago. Cody Cook interviewed me about my episode 89, which I put a lot of work into, which was my What is Biblical Anarchy Redux, a sort of a updated edition of my original What is Biblical Anarchy pilot episode 1, when I started this podcast with the Libertarian Christian Institute. So we go through a lot of not just what I covered in that episode, but Cody raised some interesting questions and objections, and as I kind of alluded to in the intro, just really talking about what anarchy really means. So I thought it was a good interview that Cody did and good conversation that we had. And it just gets at some of the theory and the technical nitty gritty of what biblical anarchy is. And so I thought that I would replay that for you in case some of you here on this side haven't listened to it. But I would encourage everyone to, of course, who listens to me to listen to our flagship podcast, the Libertarian Christians Podcast. I do make quite a few appearances over there. And then check out all of our podcasts at the Christians for Liberty Network. We have Alex Bernardo with the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, of course. We have Greg and Carrie over at Reformed Libertarians. And although they don't release quite as often, they've been more active recently. And then, of course, we do have podcasts which aren't active anymore, but there's a whole archive that you can go listen to, including Mike Meharry on Godarchy, Good News, Bad News, and then 2 podcasts that Norm usually does, the Faith Seeking Freedom podcast, and then the Faith Ventures podcast, which are very interesting as well. So that's all I have for you guys for as far as introductions here. So I'll go ahead and switch over to, by the way, you're going to get shell shocked because you're going to see me from the past with glasses and a full beard. So just be ready for that. I'll talk to you on the flip side.
All right. Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm your host, Cody Cook, and my guest is Jacob Winograd, LCI colleague and host of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. If you've been paying attention to Libertarian Christian Institute, you're already familiar with Jacob. So Jacob, thanks for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. I'm on the LCI YouTube channel a lot, but I actually haven't been on the Libertarian Christians Podcast formally in a hot minute. So it's good to be back. And back with you now as one of the new, I guess, co-host, or I don't know what your how you and Doug are titling yourselves now that you're sharing duties.
Yeah, we're consubstantial. No, we're co-hosts and 2 hypostases and one ousios.
Does Cody proceed from the LCP?
Okay, so some will get that. I apologize for those who don't. So this month, he released an episode of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast called What is Biblical Anarchy Redux? And so this was essentially like you going back to your first episode where you kind of are introducing the whole biblical anarchy thing and kind of how you're approaching it, what your methodology is and what the history is, what the terms mean. And so what made you want to revisit this topic? I mean, do biblical and anarchy still mean the same thing that they did when you started the podcast? Has the meaning shifted in those terms, or did you switch to a Catholic Bible where now there's more to take into consideration? What happened there?
Now, much to the chagrin of my surprisingly large amount of Catholic audience, no, I've not reunited with the Church of Rome, unfortunately, for some people. No, I mean, I decided, I've been thinking about it for a while, and I guess the decision was mostly because it's been a couple years since I started the podcast with LCI, and I just have a different audience now. I've refined some of my arguments. I've added more arguments to kind of like my overall case through doing several different debates and just learning. You're always reading and kind of refining your ideas. And so I thought it was we're kind of over the 2-year mark, and I thought it'd be a good idea to, and also because the original episode's audio only, and now we do video here at LCI. So I said, all these reasons combined, it's a good time as any to kind of revisit the pilot episode, update it, give it a fresh coat of paint, add some new bells and whistles to it, and relaunch it for the people who maybe haven't gone back and seen the first episode. And that way, the kind of like premise of the show is just further up the podcast feed and not like people have to scroll the whole way back down to the bottom.
Yeah, so you're worried essentially that you were getting Nixoned, that people who could just hear you would not be as persuaded by those who could actually see your beautiful face and to see how wonderful you made how wonderful you looked making the presentation. Is that about the size of it?
Well, I mean, everyone knows that the longer your beard, the more sound your theological takes are. And I've put a lot of time into this bushy mess that's on the bottom of my face. And so I figured that people are going to take it 3 times more seriously now than they did the first time I released it.
Yeah, I think, maybe it's 6 to 1 have it as the other, but I would say the longer your beard is, the bigger your beard is, the more reformed you are, because most Wesleyans tend to avoid those big beards. So,
but you repeat yourself.
Yeah, I bet I repeat myself. All right. So you define anarchy as self-ownership, which sounds good, but I do have 2 maybe kind of questions, potential pushback maybe. From an anarchist perspective, do you think that early left anarchists like Joseph Proudhon would agree with that definition? Would they understand anarchism that way? And then from a Christian perspective, doesn't God own us? I mean, how does self-ownership fit into these schemas?
Yeah, no, those are good questions. So I would say Proudhon doesn't obviously use the term self-ownership, but his writings do align with that concept. In What is Property, he emphasizes that individuals have a right to the products of their own labor, arguing that anything taken without contributing labor or capital is akin to theft. And this principle, I think, inherently upholds the autonomy of individuals over their own labor and the fruits of their labor. Additionally, he has a statement, which I actually rather like. I cited in the episode. He says, whoever puts a hand on me to govern me is a usurper and a tyrant. I declare him my enemy. So I think that kind of definitely echoes the idea of self-ownership. He definitely has a resistance to external control over the individual. So even though he's not maybe arguing for the idea in explicit terms, the same way that maybe the more individualist right-leaning anarchists like Rothbard and all them conceive of it, the foundation uses kind of the same principles. And then you also asked about, well, doesn't God own us? And yes, from a Christian perspective, God absolutely does own us. He's the creator, the sustainer of life, the ultimate authority over all creation. When I talk about self-ownership in the context of biblical anarchy, I'm referring to horizontal relationships, how we interact with one another as human beings. And so self-ownership in this sense is about affirming that no one else has a rightful claim over another person's body or labor or property, and that's usually done through initiating coercion. So I'm addressing these horizontal dynamics and rejecting unjust human hierarchies while affirming our vertical relationship with God places him as king over all. And I would say that this distinction, these go together very neatly. We clarify that self-ownership does not challenge God's sovereignty, but emphasizes that there are limits on different types of human authority over one another. And I think that's sort of where the mantra, no king but Christ, which has long been associated with the Christian anarchist movement or philosophy, whatever you want to call it, it acknowledges Christ's kingship and its implications. If Christ is king, then no human has a rightful claim to that type of authority which Christ has.
Yeah, so, I mean, labor gives me a right to ownership, as Proudhon argues, and I haven't worked on myself at all. Does that mean I no longer own myself?
Yeah, I guess it's funny. Yeah, if you're lazy and slothful and not moving towards any, then I can come and it's like I discovered a wild Cody Cook who hasn't done anything in 2 years. I can homestead.
Homestead, that's the word I was looking for. You can homestead me. Yeah. Okay, so maybe another way to say, self-ownership, that would be perhaps most confusing in a theological context, would be self-responsibility, that you are ultimately held accountable for your actions. So only you as a person who makes choices, you're held accountable for those choices by God. And so we could call that self-ownership, But maybe another way to think about it is like a stewardship, self-stewardship. You have been given yourself to steward, and ultimately God is going to decide your fate and what to do with you, but it's based on what you choose to do with what he's given you.
Yeah, I would say it's more theologically accurate to say self-stewardship. Self-ownership is sort of, I guess, kind of a legal conception. And so in the realm of law, we treat one another and interact with one another in terms of dealing with ownership of the individuals own themselves and they own their property. But yeah, if you're taking a more theological perspective on it, it would be stewardship in if you're like sort of making a synthesis of the vertical and horizontal dynamic there. So yeah, it's a good way to put it.
So I mean, we kind of hinted at this a little bit, this idea that the early anarchists had kind of a negative or complicated relationship to the idea of private property. I mean, how did they think about property ownership? And with that in mind, if we see it differently, is there a sense in which maybe we don't have a right to claim the word, or is the word bigger than how maybe some of the early proponents defined it?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. If you've spent any time on old Facebook pages or groups or on X and you encounter the left anarchists today, they often do have a disdain for the right-leaning anarchists and their hashtag or quote-unquote not real anarchists. Just no libertarian is a real libertarian. So I would say the early anarchists had a complicated relationship with property, and they did view property and ownership as sometimes a source of oppression. So Proudhon had this famous line, property is theft, but his views did later evolve, and I addressed this in the episode, because he kind of later became a bit more jaded and thought, well, property is sort of this bulwark against state power, because the more you own and the more you have the ability to control what you own, the less the state has ability to interfere with your life. So there's more nuance there than perhaps some people see on a surface level. In terms of, can we still call ourselves that initial word if the views don't line up? I liken this to like the development of science. So think about like Newtonian physics compared to like modern physics, right? So like Newtonian physics laid a foundation, but as science progressed, those concepts were refined to account for new discoveries and inconsistencies with some of the older models and equations. So the early anarchists and their fundamental critiques of the state, of unjust hierarchy and coercion were pretty much accurate, but I think they missed the mark on property and capitalism because they lacked a fully developed understanding of economics and human action. To be fair, there is some merit and underlying truth to their critiques of property. The way that rent seeking and the way that markets operate within the statist paradigm can lend themselves to constructing artificial hierarchies and sort of like radically imbalanced wealth distributions that they don't seem fair, and they're really not natural free market outcomes. So their underlying critiques, I think, are actually worth some consideration. But I know you're going to get into this, but like from a Rothbardian perspective, and we add a more sound understanding of economics, we see that we can separate those injustices or inefficiencies or those outcomes that do lend towards coercion, which they called out, aren't necessarily tied to property and capitalism themselves, but more sort of the statist distortion of those things.
Yeah, I wish I had pulled this together before I had this conversation, but I want to say that it was either maybe Proudhon or Bakunin who had said something to the effect of, maybe once the state was out of the equation, property ownership would not necessarily be a problem. But I think there's maybe, to me, coming into the conversation when I was kind of fresh at it, trying to understand it, it seemed to me that the anarcho-communists, as much as they might not like the idea of private property, my thought was, well, who's going to stop somebody from owning something? They're not hurting someone, and there's not like a state, or is everybody just going to get together and take their farm? And is that really anarchism? Yeah. So, okay. So we mentioned Rothbard. So we're describing the history of anarchist thought. Maybe we skip some of the figures who are maybe you might call anarcho-centrists, guys like Lysander Spooner, who aren't really quite to the left and aren't necessarily anarcho-capitalists either. So then we move into the 20th century. We've got guys like Murray Rothbard. Now we're talking about something a little bit different, so what we call maybe the right anarchists or the anarcho-capitalists. So where does he come in and what does he contribute to the conversation?
Yeah, Murray Rothbard plays a pretty pivotal role in sort of the development of what would be like modern anarchism, especially in the West and on the right. And I think he's someone who really synthesizes ideas within the libertarian and anarchist banner into a comprehensive, unified framework. And of course, I'm Reformed, so like that appeals to me, right? You could say Rothbard's the first to make like a systematic theology of anarchism in a way where it's all comprehensive and
he's the Theodore Beza of anarchism.
Yeah, exactly. So Rothbard sort of took some influence from guys like you mentioned, like Lysander Spooner and also Benjamin Tucker and even Proudhon, who emphasized voluntarism, individual sovereignty. Guys like Spooner and Tucker were big on the idea of like individual contracts, voluntary contracts, things like that. So he's taking those ideas, and at the same time, he's a student of Ludwig von Mises, which is the school of Austrian economics. And so he's able to sort of bridge through these influences anarchism and capitalism, which up until this point are two concepts that were often sort of viewed as incompatible. And so he drew on the Austrian understanding of human action, grounded in the subjective theory of value, marginal utility, and individuals acting in their own rational self-interest. And this allowed him to demonstrate how state, kind of like I alluded to earlier, how state intervention through monopolies, central banking, coercion, how these things distort markets, human relationships, and the natural evolution of law, of wealth distribution. And so Rothbard's work sort of builds on those initial anarchist critiques of the state as a coercive institution, providing then bolstering it with this rigorous economic foundation and critique and creating a unified theory, which we know as anarcho-capitalism today. And I think it's a very robust school of thought. I obviously am more persuaded by Rothbardian anarchism, anarcho-capitalism than left or center anarchism, but I do try to be ecumenical with the more mutualists or market anarchist types, like those who don't like the term anarcho-capitalist or who may be a bit more market skeptical. I think there's a place for them, and I think that we're ultimately united under the same banner. We just sometimes have different emphases or different economic views.
Well, yeah, I mean, on that point, I mean, as I read Rothbard, I feel like there's so much that I agree with him on: self-ownership, property rights, non-aggression principle, voluntary relationships. And this is maybe one area that we've talked about before. One area where I struggle with a little bit is that it seems like anarcho-capitalists really put the accent on private property. Well, that's kind of their centering principle, to the extent that I think the notion of shared spaces, like a town square, roads, parks, rivers, is seen as problematic. Everything should be privately owned in the Rothbardian scheme, whether it's a river or an ocean, or whatever, it should be privately owned. And so while I understand concerns about the tragedy of the commons, that when you have a space that belongs to everyone, it often tends to be taken care of by no one, it seems that everything being privatized has its own potential downsides. And we could maybe talk about different theoretical concerns that they could come up with that. But that's why I think, even though I'm basically in this kind of anarcho-capitalist space, I'm not an anarcho-communist, I tend not to call myself an ANCAP. I like anarchists. I think maybe voluntarist for me puts the proper accent on things. But this kind of gets to this whole thing about these different labels, these different words, which are, I think, really in many cases, just different accents. And so what are your thoughts on how we use these labels? And maybe another way to say it is, what are your anarchist pronouns?
My pronouns are privatize everything. So yeah, I mean, listen, I think you did a good job at asking that question, sort of steel manning the Rothbardian position. I think the reason, so my preface here is that there's a reason why are so insistent on everything being privately owned, because your objection seems reasonable. Okay, on the local level or on whatever scale, like you tell me there can't be any spaces that are shared. Like we have to have, like every single square inch of society has to have it either unowned, unhomesteaded property, or someone has to own it. The reason why anarcho-capitalists, especially the Rothbardian tradition, are really insistent on that is because, and you sort of alluded to this, that when we don't have private ownership over things, there tends to be some problems. When we have everything that is homesteaded property clearly accounted for, this actually minimizes conflict in society. It doesn't eliminate it, right? But it's a lot easier to sort of know who's allowed to do what with what things, right? When they're clearly, okay, that belongs to you, that belongs to you. Whereas when you have shared spaces, whether that's a town square or parks, roads, rivers, without that, so you have sort of what you alluded to, the tragedy of the commons, and you don't, so it's fine until there's a problem, right? If everyone's just sort of in the shared space and no one has a dispute, then that works out okay. when suddenly there's a dispute over how are we going to use this shared space and the resources or property within this shared space, well, the way that we usually would solve a conflict over a piece of property is to see who is the owner. But if it's collectively owned, that does present a problem in terms of delineating who's allowed to use what piece of property. So I think that there are, however, ways of clearing this up within the Rothbardian system. There are ways to construct quote unquote shared property. It might not be called that, or it might not be the best way to describe it, but it could be functionally that way through voluntary and legal means. For example, a community could create a corporate entity or a co-op structure where individuals hold shares of ownerships. And so then the owner would be, well, this entity owns it. And this entity is then owned by all the different shareholders. And that would come with some kind of contract for dispute resolution, for clear delineations of what's allowed to be used, what isn't allowed to be used, how people are going to use it, etc. And so that approach, I think, enables kind of the heart of what some people want, which is this idea of shared spaces, but while remaining consistent with the principles of private property and minimizing the potential for conflict. I think there's reasonable concerns that people raise about the risks of privatizing everything. People have concerns over could there be possibility of being landlocked, that you're unable to travel or go somewhere you need to go, or certain exploitation that could happen. I think in general, my response is that in a free market society, markets are incredibly adaptive and eager to meet the needs wherever there is a demand. So I think transportation access or these sort of shared spaces, if they're valuable to people, if someone wants them, then entrepreneurs are going to step in and they're going to meet that demand because there's a profit to be made when you provide a service that people want. That's the basis of free markets. Now, I'm not saying this process is perfect because it isn't, and sometimes it doesn't move quick enough, right? But I guess the question that I often ask, which is one of many memes that'll come up probably in the course of this conversation, is compared to what? And we have to avoid what I call the nirvana fallacy or the perfect solution fallacy. This is not a perfect system. There can be instances where perhaps the outcome of the free market principles isn't our preference or what we want. But compared to the state-run systems, which are rife with inefficiency and coercion and exploitation, I still think the market-based alternative is going to be a vast improvement on the status quo. Nothing's ever perfect, except, of course, the Reformed doctrines of grace.
Well, so I'll push back just a little bit, only just to kind of, because I think it's an interesting conversation, and we don't have to solve it today, but a couple of things that sort of occurred to me as I was listening to you talk is that it seemed like when you talked about one potential way to solve this problem, and you sort of invoked this idea of the trust, and what you sort of described was community property. You just used capitalist language to describe it. And so, maybe that's talking about sort of the accent on it or whatever, but everybody at the Libertarian Christian Institute decided we were going to come together and build a town, and we wanted to have public roads and a town square, and we had sort of a contract for how it was going to be supported voluntarily. And we had rules for how they were supposed to be used. That's just community rules. That's just community guidelines or laws that we're sort of held to. That's not really drastically different than what I'm proposing, even if we call it a trust, right?
I think so it might not be much different. I guess when we've talked about this in the past, and I've been down this road myself and once thought there wasn't a problem with I guess, quote unquote, group property. Again, this is one of those things where sort of what you said, like the ANCOMs who go private property's bad, but then it's like, well, without a state, who's going to stop you, right? And to some extent, sure, we eliminate the state tomorrow and then we all go and we don't write up something formal and we just say, hey, we collectively own this. No one's really going to stop us, right? The issue comes with the more you scale that out. Listen, within the context of a home, of a family, right? I'm not saying you need to be obnoxious about this where you sit down with your wife and go, so listen, whose table is this? Is this your table? Is this my table? Is this our table? Right, or the toilet, or your bed, right?
Yeah.
So I'm not saying you have to take it to that extreme, right? Because if you have a conflict over the kitchen table or your living room sofa or something, but at the same time, that can sound ridiculous, but we also know from case studies that sometimes in divorce court, people literally go to the extremes of cutting up their furniture when they are dividing property in messy divorces, right? So The emphasis here is on avoiding conflict. And when conflict happens, how do we resolve the conflict? And I think I'm really motivated by the expression prevention is better than cure. If you don't have things set up ahead of time to have clear delineations of how to resolve conflict and because the ultimate expression of ownership is the ability to exclude, which creates a problem for group ownership, because if you all own it, how do you know who can exclude whom from doing what? So when you form it through a trust, when you form it using the fundamental principles of private ownership as the basis, that gives you the same ends. I'm not really against the ends. I'm just saying you have to form them in a way that is less likely to produce problems.
Okay, fair enough. We'll move on to the next question, because I think I've explained my concern and you've given your response. So to justify anarchism from a Christian perspective. So we're getting out of anarchist theory and application here, and we're kind of trying to root this in the biblical side now. So you quote 1 Samuel 8, where Israel demands a king and therefore rejects Yahweh. And so you're arguing that before this period, kind of in the period of the judges, this was kind of like an anarchist society. And I think I struggled a little bit with that, because it's not as if that the pre-monarchist Israel was stateless and it wasn't a voluntary society if they were following the law of Moses, at least, because the law of Moses is certainly not. I mean, if I said, let's build an anarchist society and the first thing we're going to do is round up the people who don't take leaven out of their house on Passover and stone them, you wouldn't say that was a voluntary society. And so what would you say to a critic who argued that in the period of the judges, Israel may have been decentralized, but they weren't anarchists? And maybe if I can complicate this a little bit, how would you respond if they said that this decentralized order is treated in Judges as a bad thing, that bad things happened because there was no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and that monarchy sort of solves that problem, centralization fixes that problem?
Right. So the answer is confident theology. We can go on to the next question. No, I'm just kidding. I had to throw that in there somewhere. That was the best one. So in all seriousness, I think we need to make some careful distinctions here, and it's a good question. While the form of government, I addressed this in the episode, while the form of governance during the judges period was decentralized and closer to anarchy, the laws being enforced, of course, reflected the theological nature of covenantal Israel under the Mosaic covenant. So this theocratic context was typological and somewhat eschatological, or pointing toward eschatological things in nature, pointing ultimately forward to Christ. And the laws enforced were not strictly based on what would be following the non-aggression principle today outside of the Mosaic covenant, right? Because obviously there was laws prescribing coercion to be used on behavior, which that in and of itself maybe was sinful, but wasn't acts of aggression. So the enforcement of these laws had a divine purpose, specific to Israel's role in redemptive history, which does set it apart from the kind of governance I am advocating for as in my case for biblical anarchy. That said, my argument from 1 Samuel 8 is primarily focused on the construction and form of governance rather than the specific laws being forced. The demand for a king in 1 Samuel 8 was a rejection of decentralized, God-centered governance in favor of centralized human authority. So in my episode, I make a similar distinction by comparing forms of governance like monarchy and democracy. Either form could enforce laws protecting gun rights, for example, or conversely, restricting them. Or we can complicate it more and say, well, imagine we had a monarchy that upheld the right to bear arms, and a democracy which did not uphold the right to bear arms. And then we'd have to go, well, you could still make an argument that you like democracy more than monarchy, even though you would say that you don't like when the democracy had laws that weren't upholding natural rights by taking away people's rights to own certain property in the pursuit of being able to defend themselves. So that's kind of that separation, I think, is important. We have to be able to do that to make clear analyses and critiques of governments and states, looking at the content of the laws and also the structure of governance. So in conclusion, this question then I think requires us to view governance on a spectrum. On one end, you have the total state, and on the other, total anarchy. The governance style of Israel during the time of Judges is far closer to anarchy than it is to statism in terms of the form. It was a decentralized system where authority was distributed among tribes, and the judges were raised up as temporary leaders to resolve specific disputes or solve certain crises that popped up, rather than functioning as like a standing government. This decentralized model avoided the dangers of centralization while keeping government localized and limited, which is a key principle of biblical anarchy, or anarchy as I'm arguing for. The second part of the question being then, well, what if someone said, fine, it was decentralized and close to anarchy, but that's a bad thing because the text says, well, everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And it seems to be sort of like setting you up for the beginning of 1 Samuel where they ask for a king. Well, 1 Samuel doesn't really celebrate them asking for a king as a solution to this problem. And I think if we even just go like outside of the text and we just then look at what happens next, all of the problems that plagued Israel during the time of the judges continue after the institution of the monarchy, and at best stay the same, or in many cases, I think are then exaggerated, made worse, made more perpetual. Now, instead of one tribe falling into idolatry, the entire nation is led into idolatry by a king. So the way I like to put it is this way, because again, anarchy is not a utopian system, doesn't say it's going to solve the problems of human sin or anything like that. Rather, I like to say that anarchy is the worst form of government other than all the other forms. Kind of like the thing people say about capitalism, right? It's the worst economic system other than all the other ones, right? So anarchy is not a guarantee of utopia. It's just a recognition that the introduction of monopoly governance does not make anything better.
Yeah, so I mean, in kind of response to your first point there, I guess maybe that in the judges period, we'd call that like almost like a states' rights theonomy, kind of a Pat Buchanan sort of paleo-con type thing. But the second part, I think you have something of a strong answer there, but there is something going on in the text in Judges where they say that people did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king. And so there is a connection. And I think you're right that things don't necessarily get better on the whole once you introduce the king. In fact, what you sort of have is a system, maybe on some level, they're not saying the king is going to fix it, but maybe they're describing the type of disorder that you're going to have. So I
agree that we do need a king. It's just we don't need a fully human king. What we need is a perfect king. We need a king like what Deuteronomy 17 describes. Unfortunately, no king, not David, not Solomon, none of them are able to actually be the king that we need, right? Maybe they're the king we deserve, to invoke a Batman reference, but they're not the king we need. The king we need is ultimately all of the failed kings, the entire Mosaic covenant Israel point forward to the true king who comes that we do need, which is Jesus. But then the kingdom he establishes is not a earthly political kingdom to deal with sin, but rather it's an eternal spiritual kingdom that is able to save us from our sin. So, and then while we are living, waiting in expectation for the final culmination of that kingdom, we do have prescriptions for governance today, but they're no longer supposed to be as they're prescribed in terms of the law prescribed in the Mosaic covenant. But we can derive, I think, logical entailments about the form and structure of governance from sort of looking at these Old Testament narratives and sort of the principles at play there, which is that Jesus, the true king, is the only remedy to sin, and the state is ill-equipped for handling sin. And I think that I don't want to jump the gun too much. There are arguments. I'm not arguing for no government at all or no governance at all. I do think there's a role for that, but its role is extremely narrow in focus and scope. It's not meant to be a solution to the problem of what Judges points out is a true problem, that everyone does what's right in their own eyes. They are acting because of a consequence of the fall. They are sort of possessed by their own sinful nature. And that's a problem that continues to be something we face with today. We just know that the state, that human kings outside of Christ are not able to actually solve that problem. So it's tough because we have to examine these texts through multiple lenses. The primary lens, I think, should always be the sort of fulfillment and historic redemptive hermeneutic. And insofar as those are primary, the primary lesson of all of this is pointing to our need for Christ. But there are kind of like secondary lessons of theological truths we can derive, and then also philosophical truths we can derive as well.
Well, and I agree with what you said about it invoking Jesus as king. I think my only pushback is before we get into the meta narrative, I think we have to sort of understand what's going on in each piece and then sort of place it within that larger context. And I think to maybe say, I think something you kind of maybe talked about a little bit or hinted at least, maybe one way to kind of understand, to kind of put into conversation what's going on in 1 Samuel 8, where getting the king is described as sort of a bad thing, and then Judges, which seems to perhaps imply that it would be better to have a king, is that if we sort of understand maybe what Judges is saying is not actually that it would be better to have a king, but that there's a certain kind of sin that happens when you have a king and a certain kind of sin that happens when you don't have a king. And that what's going on in Judges is you have periods and places and different segments of the population who are all doing what was right in their own eyes. Some are fulfilling the Torah, some are not fulfilling the Torah because it's all sort of decentralized. But then once you have a king, if you have a relatively good king, then the country as a whole is relatively good, meaning like loyal to Yahweh. But once you have a disloyal king, he sort of sets the tone for what's going to happen below him. And so then the whole nation becomes implicit in sin. Whereas in the Judges period, it wasn't quite that way. Each sort of segment of society, each different tribes or different cities were kind of, or even individuals maybe, were sort of more responsible for themselves, and it wasn't necessarily the whole country's sin. Is that a potentially good reading of what's going on here?
I mean, I think it is. I just think that, and the reason, and I think I'm making the same analysis you are, but maybe I'm jumping the gun a bit, because I think that is sort of what's getting set up. But I think just once you zoom out and like you run through the entire history of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, you see that even the best kings really kind of fall short of doing what you say that would be good for them to do, which is to lead the country well. And if you have a good king, then it's still not perfect, but it's like better because everyone's kind of being led in a more positive direction. And even the quote unquote good kings like David, Solomon for a time, maybe a couple others, they really do mostly fall short. And even when they have periods of time where they lead people in a positive direction, and we see this today even with democratic republics, right? Like we might have for a small time an administration that does some marginal good, but it's so easy then for the next administration to come and not only undo all that, but then make it worse. And so we have to be able to sort of, I think, again, these are secondary in a sense, lessons and entailments, but they're important ones to kind of look at it and go, all right, if we're going to try to find the least bad form of governance for us to live under now in this sort of church age that we live in, then while we're waiting for the eschaton, for Christ's return, like looking back at biblical history, and I'd argue also world history, seems like the bigger the state, the more potential there is for major catastrophe. Whereas at least when the state is smaller, or I'd argue just abolish the state entirely, it doesn't mean that there's not still problems to deal with, but it seems like there are more solutions on hand, I would argue, to mitigate those problems. And even a good state is only good for so long, right? I mean, we live here in America. We can look back at our country's founding and maybe look at times where the government did some good things for periods of time, but once you introduce that monopoly, you can't ensure it's always going to be a good person or good administration at the top, and that's sort of the problem.
No, that's a fair point. And I want to note for people who are listening, as a host, I'm generally supposed to be gracious and not push back very much, but we're friends and we argue all the time. So people are kind of getting a little
We're just
window.
Doing this on a podcast instead of over Signal chat at Nasum. So
that's right. So I just want to make sure people know it's because we feel comfortable with each other that we can do this. And as a general rule, if somebody's listening to this and maybe a potential future guest, I'm probably not going to completely come at you. Okay. So moving into the New Testament a little bit more. So this is kind of connected to a point that connected to a point we've debated before on Christian pacifism. So in your reading of Romans 12 through 13, you argue that Christians aren't called to be pacifists because while Christians, you say, like in Romans 12, it says Christians shouldn't seek revenge or respond to evil with more evil. But you kind of bring us into Romans 13. At least this is kind of my as I kind of heard what I heard you saying, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong. You feel like when it talks about civil governance wielding the sword against wrongdoers, that we can, as Christians, can kind of put ourselves in that position. And I think this is one area where we would, I believe, disagree if I'm getting you right, because as I read Romans 12 through 13, I think Paul was actually setting up a pretty important contrast here by repeating words and ideas. So, in particular, this word revenge, which in Greek, it's, and Christians are told to not seek revenge. We're told to not seek ektikeo, because vengeance, same root word, it's ektikasis in where it shows up here, because vengeance belongs to God, and he uses the magistrate as an avenger, ekdixos. And so you see that Paul sort of uses variants of this word. So he's kind of, I think, creating sort of a path, and the path is, we don't seek revenge, we leave it to God. One of the ways God seeks vengeance against the evildoer is through the magistrate. And so it's this vengeance which the state or the government, however you want to talk about it, performs, and that Paul actually calls evil. Paul says that kind of vengeance is actually evil. It's something Christians shouldn't do. He exhorts Christians to not participate in that vengeance, right? So instead, if our enemy's hungry, we feed him. We don't put on a cop uniform and shoot him. So doesn't Romans 12 through 13 actually constitute a positive argument for Christian separation from all government violence and maybe even for Christian pacifism? Or am I mishearing it? Because it seemed like you were sort of saying Christians who are told in Romans 12 to not seek vengeance are actually told to seek vengeance as magistrates in Romans 13.
See, the real reason I decided to redo this episode is because now that you're co-hosting the Libertarian Christian Podcast, I view this as like a incursion of Anabaptist pacifism on LCI, and I have to fight back.
It's a pacifist takeover. We're not sending our best. Takeover.
Yeah, I mean, just that book cover with those violent Anabaptist peace bombs that you're throwing.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot there. This would almost be like, delving back into the pacifist debate, So let's examine these Greek words, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce as well as you did, ektikeo and ektikasis. So these are key to understanding, I think, Paul's argument in Romans 12 and 13. And this is one of those things where, not that I'm an expert on Greek, but like I know enough to know how stupid I am, right? So when you're there's so many words, that concepts and terms that don't translate well from language to language and language, right? Because like in English, we have sometimes clear delineations for concepts and terms that in other languages, it's like they'll have one word or two words that kind of mean 10 different things. And you have to be really careful about the context that they're brought up in to sort of understand how it's being used.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you would, I guess, agree with me in a general sense that there are scholars on your side of this and scholars on my side of this in terms of like how they're looking at the Greek. But just to give it my best pass of what I think it's saying, I think that it's making a distinction between revenge, like in the seeking of personal revenge, and more broadly speaking, the pursuit of justice and vengeance. So in Romans 12:19, Paul says, never avenge yourselves. So scholars like N.T. Wright, or you have church fathers like Chrysostom, have interpreted this as a prohibition against personal revenge, not a prohibition against the concept of like justice or civil justice itself. Paul is acknowledging evil as real, and he's urging us to trust in God's judgment to deal with that evil. I think this is more on like a meta level, right? Like we're not going to be able to, and we're not actually called to apply sort of perfect godly justice or ultimate justice upon people for their sin. And that's why he says like vengeance is mine alone. Like when people sin, they are sinning against us, but ultimately the gravest part of their sin is that they're sinning against God, and it is God's prerogative to either judge that sin or to extend mercy for those who are in Christ. And then I think Romans 13 is sort of following up with that and saying, well, okay, like evil is a real thing, and God's not saying that while we live here on earth, we're to live in sort of a disordered society where you don't have any response to evil actions that actually propose a problem for society, like violence and the breaching of contract and a breach of civil justice ultimately. And so Romans 13 is then like following up the end of Romans 12 to describe how civil governance serves God's plan to approximate justice in the present age, with the magistrate acting as God's servant. This is, again, something that Chrysostom makes a slight appeal to. N.T. Wright also makes a pretty strong case for this in his Paul, I think it's which volume? I think it's Paul for Everyone, and it's the one on Romans. So I'm trying to make an effort to not cite Reformed theologians, so I don't get the you're just citing Reformed people.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, I think what I would say, is that there are two readings that you could bring in here. One is an anarchist reading, and one is a statist reading. And so I wouldn't say that because you could quote N.T. Wright, you could quote Chrysostom, you could quote Augustine, you could quote Spurgeon, for all I care. If is the question, is it a statist reading or is it an anarchist reading? And I think, I guess I don't want to make this whole thing about an argument between us, because I just think it's an interesting thing to talk about. But it seems to me. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so are you saying that my interpretation is more of a statist interpretation, and that the only anarchist reading is the pacifist one?
I think it's the most logical reading. So if Paul says, Paul says, God says, don't seek revenge, leave revenge to me. One of the ways which I, as God, can seek vengeance is to use the state. But remember, you don't do that. You're over here. It is like at least a separationist kind of anarchist reading, that God uses the state or civil government or whatever you want to call it to punish evildoers. So it's not, anyway. So I think, what's the guy's name who wrote the book on civil government? David Lipscomb. He talked about how, civil government is essentially not really a positive thing. It's actually sort of a negative thing because it punishes. It doesn't really do good to people. It just does evil to evil people. And that does good in kind of the meta sense.
So
right?
The reason, I'm very familiar with this argument. One of my good friends, Stephen Rose of the Anarchy Christian Podcast, that's been his reading of Romans 12 and Romans 13. And he's not even a strict pacifist, although I call him a functional one. So I understand that. I think there's consistency there to a degree, but where I push back on it is that I think that it's sort of equivocating the responding with an attempt to right a wrong with the wrong itself. To put it other way, I don't think that it's equal. I don't think that pursuing justice or making victims whole, right, things like that, are equivalent with the evil that made them not whole in the first place. And that's kind of where it's that way of reading these texts doesn't make sense to me, because I think what Romans 12 is saying is, listen, if you break my car, right, like you come and key my car, you smash in my windows, you write some insults about Calvin on there and whatnot, and things like that, and then I go to your car and slash the tires, and well, that's repaying evil for evil, right? I'm returning like with. But if you do all that stuff to my car and then I take you to court, right? Like, I'm pursuing justice. I'm looking for civil justice, right? And even in an anarchist legal framework, right, there'd be some kind of penalty inflicted upon you for the damage you did to my car, and you'd be forced, in a sense, to pay some kind of remedy to that. I don't think that's not repaying evil for evil. You know what I mean? And now that maybe that's different for like property, and maybe that you think that doesn't extend to, okay, now it's if you attack me and I'm seeking justice for that, gets into a whole bunch of other weeds in terms of if self-defense is allowed or not, and what kind of force we're allowed to use, the stuff we covered in our debate. And then I would still apply the same principle that there is a difference between me responding to your evil with I'm going to get you back, and me responding to your evil with I'm going to stop the evil and seek justice to be done. And I think the key here is to do your best not to take it into your own hands. That's why I view civil governance as like it is a godly ordained sphere and role. And so my reading does line up with maybe the more statist reading, other than I just think that the statist reading is done by people who I think read the text right and just make the false equivalency between the state and civil governance and don't realize you can have one without the other.
And I do definitely agree with you there. I don't think Paul is telling you what kind of government should exist. He's just saying that there should be some kind of form of civil governance that does this. I think maybe a couple points of pushback, and then I'll let you respond, and then we'll move on because we don't want to do the whole thing on this, is I think twofold. So Paul says, don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So Paul seems to think that whatever it is that you're returning would be evil. So even though I understand the logic of kind of, well, I'm making it right, there is a sense in which Paul is equating those two things, the initial act of aggression and the response of aggression. The other part is Romans 13 doesn't talk about making reparations at all. It talks about how the magistrate goes around with a sword, and let me see here. they'll receive, and those whom they go after receive condemnation, that they actually have something to fear because the magistrate bears the sword as a minister of God, an avenger to bring wrath on the one who practices evil. So if we're sort of saying, well, it would be wrong for me to return violence for violence on a personal level, well, Paul is saying that the state actually, or whatever you want to call it, does return violence against violence. But he says Christians shouldn't do that, which I do think that there's at least, there's some logic to separating Christians from the state based on Romans 12 and 13.
But I still think I think that in order for us to be able to agree on sort of like the libertarian premise that the initiation of violence is where the crime is committed, it still seems to me that there would be a logical fallacy or contradiction there to equate the initiation of force with the non-initiation of force. And that, I think, is my fundamental critique of that position, because it seems to equate them. I don't think that's what Paul is trying to say. If Paul had said in more clear terms, listen, do not respond to evil, even with an attempt to defend yourself, but he says don't respond to evil with evil, that means that you would respond with the same. Now listen, force is the same as force, I guess, but initiatory force isn't the same as responsive force. So I think that's why I don't read it the way that you're reading it ultimately. And I just think that when you go to Romans 13, I just don't like Lipscomb's reading there, because he tries to square, like, the line that to me is really crucial is that he is God's minister or servant for your good. And he tries to solve that by saying, well, listen, God uses evil kingdoms and men all the time to accomplish things for your good, right? And sometimes even the bad things that happen to you are for your good. But I think that's to really, like, to me, that's just a lot of steps to get around the plain reading of the text, which are describing the civil magistrate in this sense as actually being a force for good, not a force for evil that God is able to then subvert and use for eventually good purposes. That just seems to me to be a little bit more of a workaround. And I do tend to try to, and I'm not saying I never do this with maybe other texts, right? But I do, because there are some texts that maybe you have to be careful about not doing a plain reading of just the surface level. But there needs to be a good reason to be like, hey, this is why we can't have the plain reading of the surface level. And in this case, I don't see that. I think the way that I'm reading Romans 12 into 13 makes sense. Don't seek revenge. Rather, understand that there is a godly ordained office for pursuing approximate justice, right? It's not perfect justice, but it at least orders society in a way that minimizes and restrains human evil, while we understand that true justice can only be achieved ultimately by God. And we also think that we're thankful for the fact that God is a merciful God and doesn't just exact justice upon us all, but that has chosen to extend mercy to many of us, and Christ has taken upon himself the punishment for sin for many.
Well, I'll ask one more question on Romans 13, but I'm putting you out of the hot seat, and we're leaving what we have been talking about behind and moving into something else. So I agree with you that taxation is theft, but Paul seems to argue that Christians ought to do it anyway. And you seem, I think, at least to me, you seem like you nitpicked at Paul's exhortation to pay taxes to whom they are due by suggesting that stolen money isn't actually due at all. And there's some logic to that, but I guess I'm not sure if that's really what Paul had in mind. I'm not really sure that you can read Paul to say that. It feels, sure. I don't think Paul's making a slippery point there. I think he's saying something straightforward. So what do you think is going on here? How do you justify that reading of Paul?
Sure. So again, this is an instance again where you have to get into like the complication of the languages at play, right? So like we don't exactly have in Greek clear delineations between taxation and tributes and tolls and things like that. And then also the problem that like historical methods of taxation and tributes and the collection of those things don't really, like, none of this maps on one-to-one with our modern language and context. So we kind of have to reconcile that discrepancy from the start. Now I'm going to start with render unto Caesar, because I think that's important to lead into this. In the render unto Caesar passage, Jesus' response is often misunderstood, I would say, as an unqualified endorsement of paying taxes and it's a separation of church and state. Just give to Caesar what's Caesar, just give to God what is God's. However, people kind of miss that the whole point of the question Jesus was asked there, and it says right in the text, is that the Jewish leaders were hoping to entrap Jesus in his own words. The context being that if he was at all going to say that actually, yes, you should pay your taxes because they're owed, they would have been happy with that answer, because they were hoping he'd either say, yes, pay your taxes, and then he'd be discredited to his Jewish audience, who were very, obviously did not like paying their taxes and were very judgmental towards tax collectors. Or if he said, don't pay your taxes, then they could go to the Romans and go, hey, this guy's saying don't pay your taxes, he's stirring up civil unrest, and arrest him, right? So if Jesus was giving them what he wanted, if Jesus giving them what they wanted, then the passage wouldn't end with them walking away astounded by his answer. So we have to read past that simplistic answer people give. Rather, I think by asking whose image was on the coin and saying, render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's, Jesus is highlighting a distinction between earthly and divine obligations, first and foremost. And the implication is that we owe our ultimate allegiance and moral responsibility to God. And there's also some more there in terms of in Jesus' answer to the tax question is a critique not only of Roman authority, but of the Jewish leaders who were actually complicit in exploiting their own people under Roman rule. So the very question that was posed to Jesus was a trap, and his response exposes their hypocrisy and shifts the focus on a larger issue of allegiance and emphasizing God's ultimate claim over people. And I think it's implicitly a critique on Rome's overreach as well, but he does it in a way that side skirts getting him in trouble, because he's able to say, well, yeah, of course, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, right? But we do have to ask ourselves, what is owed to Caesar, the same way we would ask is what is owed to anybody. And I don't think that you'll find a biblical teaching anywhere, whether it's about taxation or anything else, that says, A, you owe people that which they demand through the initiation of force or the threat of force or coercion, and B, that not only are governments ordained to tax you, but that they can just tax whatever they want, and whatever they claim that they're owed is automatically fair and just, and you just owe it to them, right? Those would be pretty far stretches to try to claim. So then with that context in mind, going now back to Romans 13, I think Paul is sort of echoing the same sort of point that Jesus made in Render unto Caesar, but in his own words. So he's exhorting Christians to pay what is due, and he's applying it in even more. He's not just doing Caesar to Caesar and God what is God's. He goes, pay taxes to whom taxes, tribute to whom tribute, honor to whom honor, respect to whom respect, right? And then follows it up with saying, owe no one anything except to love them. And I think that's an important follow. People read Romans 1 through whatever that verse is and then forget the refrain of that, which is to owe nothing to anyone except to love them. And I think that begs the question then, can you love your neighbor while you're stealing from them? And is there any teaching that would say that, well, if I were to go to your house, Cody, and knock on your door and at gunpoint say, give me 50% of everything you own, because I might go build a road with it, I don't know, everyone would be like, no, that's theft. But if I suddenly put a badge on and say, oh, well, I was voted into power, or I'm the son of this person who says he has power, do I suddenly now have a right to do that? I don't think that's the biblical teaching either. So now the heart of your question then is, well, what's Paul saying? I don't think Paul is actually saying here anything directly about taxation in the same way that I don't think Jesus was necessarily meaning to directly tackle the issue of taxation. They're ultimately aimed at getting us to realize a teaching more broadly about how to love our neighbor. And yes, we should give people what they're owed. But then I think we have to ask those other questions as logical follow-ups to understand the entailment of that teaching. It makes my case maybe a little bit weaker. And I'd say Paul isn't necessarily here making my argument. My argument is my argument. I think it's a logical implication of the text. But nor do I think Paul here or Jesus in Matthew 22, 3, I forget the exact chapter number, in Render unto Caesar I don't think either of them are saying, oh, just pay your taxes because the government said to. So we have to cut it both ways.
Okay, fair enough. I think we'll wrap it up there because we're just a little bit over the hour mark. So those who want to hear the full episode that we've been discussing, where you kind of make these points kind of all together and work on it a little bit, what I'm trying to say, kind of tease it out in the details, Those want it. So first of all, it's the Biblical Anarchy Podcast. And do you know the title of the episode and the episode number for those who want to go find it?
At this point in time, I don't know the exact title. It'll probably be What is Biblical Anarchy? And I might have a tagline after it. It will be episode 89. So that should be easy enough. And you can go find it at biblicalanarchypodcast.com. And that gives you links to YouTube, Apple, Spotify, wherever you want to go watch it.
Thank you, Jacob. I really appreciate you making the time to talk with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I've time traveled back to the future and my beard is gone and my contacts are in, but I'm still the wild, bushy-haired, crazy-eyed anarchist that I was in that interview you just watched. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that it was edifying and educational. And that's all we have for you guys for this week. Please make sure you give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. 5-star reviews on Google always help, or not Google, on Apple and Spotify, wherever you listen to. Always help. At biblicalanarchypodcast.com if you want to support the show. But that's all I have. Live at peace. Live for Christ. Take care.
The Biblical Anarchy Podcast is a part of the Christians for Liberty Network, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. If you love this podcast, it helps us reach more with a message of freedom when you rate and review us on your favorite podcast apps and share with others. If you want to support the production of the Biblical Anarchy Podcast, please consider donating to the Libertarian Christian Institute at biblicalanarchypodcast.com, where you can also sign up to receive special announcements and resources related to biblical anarchy. Thanks for tuning in.